news of a brutal murder is always shocking.
A cordon has gone up around the building. Police said their search was still going on.
He was very surprised at the amount of blood that produced.
We know that he was very manipulative and charming.
But when the crime is committed by a cop, it seems even more horrific.
Locals knew the couple had not been getting on, but no one expected anything as vicious as this.
Nobody wants to believe that police officers are criminals.
To die at the hands of the very people sworn to protect us is, for me, the ultimate betrayal of trust.
This man has brought shame on the Met.
He's got a very warped moral compass and probably has some sort of power trip, a lust for power.
In his mind, he probably thought, well, I'm a police officer, so I will get away with it.
In this series, I'm going to unravel the outlandish plots, lies and deceit of officers who attempt to get away with murder. On the 5th of June 2009, Los Angeles police detective Stephanie Lazarus reported for work as normal. She was well respected, well liked, and had 26 years of service to her name. But that day, her life and career would come crashing down. Her fellow detectives had laid a carefully constructed trap, and Stephanie was walking right into it. Because what she didn't know is that her colleagues had uncovered evidence of a murder that had been hidden for over 2 decades. Evidence that proved Stephanie Lazarus was a killer.
These people are pointing at you for whatever reason.
I don't know why. That's just crazy. I mean, that's absolutely crazy.
To lead me through the investigation, I brought together a crack team of experts who will help me unravel what happened in this case and how the killer cop's training enabled her to cover up her crimes. Former top anti-corruption cop Julie Mackay, Serena Simmons, a leading psychologist, and former Met detective Howard Groves, who helped solve over 50 murders, are going to introduce me to some of the worst cases of killer coppers from around the world. Julie Mackay is a former detective superintendent that has spent a large part of her career dealing with police officers trying to get away with breaking the law. So if anyone can help me understand how the mind of a bad apple works, it's her. So this is Stephanie Lazarus.
Yes, and as you can see, Stephanie was an LAPD police officer. She was working for Los Angeles Police Department. And this case is a really strange one because it actually goes back to 1986.
And it started with a couple.
The guy called John Rutten began a relationship with a lady called Sherry Rasmussen. We know that John and Sherry were really happy together. It was like a true love story. They were living together. They were both really successful in their own independent careers.
So when was the crime committed?
So on the 24th of February 1986, we know that John had gone to work as he always did. Sherry was still at home and he'd tried to ring her mid-morning. When she didn't answer, he rang again during the course of the day, but she still wasn't answering. Now, a neighbour noticed that the garage door was open and that Sherry's car was missing. There were some workmen nearby and they discovered a purse, which later was identified as belonging to Sherry, discarded outside on some grass. Of course, these things don't really become relevant until John gets home at 6 o'clock in the evening. And he sees that there's some broken glass. And when he goes into the house, he notices that the whole property has been ransacked. There's items thrown about the place, lamps that are broken. And as he goes through, then he makes that grim discovery of Sherry lying there with 3 gunshot wounds to her body.
As well as the gunshot wounds, Sherry had an unusual bite mark on her arm. The crime scene had all the hallmarks of a burglary gone wrong, and the case was quickly shelved by the LAPD, with no suspects identified. Wind forward to over 2 decades, and on the morning of the 5th of June 2009, in LAPD headquarters, veteran detective Stephanie Lazarus was approached by two fellow cops, stating that they had information on a case she was working on. Little did she know, her police colleagues had other intentions and would capture it all on camera.
Stephanie, I don't know if you know my partner.
Hey,
great.
Hi.
Stearns, nice to
Yeah,
meet
see you guys.
How's it going?
Good.
Milling around. Well, have a seat. What this is I didn't want to bring this up in your squadron.
You're going to bring somebody in, right?
Yeah, well, I can explain the whole thing too. I didn't want to talk about this in the squadron because I don't know who people are listening.
That's true.
But we've been assigned a case that we've been looking at.
Okay.
It's a new case, and reviewing the case, there's some notes to see as far as your name being mentioned.
Okay.
Do you know John Rutten?
John Rutten?
Rutten. Were you guys friends or anything else, or?
Yeah, we were good friends.
Yeah.
In 1986, John Rutten was a recently graduated engineer from UCLA and had been married to Sherry Rasmussen for 3 blissful months, until tragedy struck. Local journalist Howard Brewer has covered this case in detail.
Sherry Rasmussen was a real doll. She was a nurse at Glendale Adventist Hospital. She was a supervisor there. She had also been a student athlete. She was kind of tall.
Sherry and John were crazy about each other from the moment they met at UCLA in 1984.
John and Sherry lived in a condo in the middle of the San Fernando Valley, which is essentially a suburb of Los Angeles. The condo that they lived in was nice. The valley in general, kind of average. There are some pockets of it that are fairly affluent and some pockets of it that are very much not. And the area was a little bit sketchy in spots. There were burglaries here and there. It was not Beverly Hills.
It was the land of the beautiful people. It encapsulated glamour and prestige, but if you scratch beneath the surface, drug addiction and gang violence was lurking.
I lived out here in late 86, early 87, and I think that was around the time that you had people just randomly shooting each other on the freeway. It was a little bit rough. There was a lot of crime.
It was on the 24th of February 1986 that crime caught up with the happy couple.
John had been trying to reach Sherry throughout the day. She was not answering her phone, and he didn't know why. But he found out when he came home, walking into the house and seeing Sherry had been murdered.
What's this all about?
Well, it's relating to his wife.
Okay.
Okay. Did you know her?
Not really. I mean, I knew that he got married years ago.
Do you remember her name or anything, or what she did for a living, or where she worked, or anything about her?
Well, I think I'm going to say I think she was a nurse.
Do you know what happened to his wife?
Yeah, I know she got killed.
Do you know what the circumstances were regarding her death?
Geez, let me think back. Geez, I don't know if it was, if it was a burglary or something.
In 1986, after discovering his wife Sherry had been shot to death, John Rutten had immediately called the police.
When they got to the scene and they saw that Sherry had been murdered, that furniture was upturned, that there was stereo equipment stacked at the bottom of the stairs, all appearances were that this was a burglary gone wrong, and it was an assumption that was reinforced for them over the next few weeks when there were a couple of other burglaries in that same area that were in some ways similar to what this one appeared to be.
What time of the day had this happened?
We know that it was in the morning because the fact that the car was missing from the garage at about 10:15, the purse is found discarded outside at about midday.
And Sherry was still in her dressing gown or nightwear.
So she's got up, maybe had a bit of a lie-in or whatever, but she's downstairs. She's certainly not had time to get dressed and get ready to go to work.
Sherry was shot dead in the living room, still dressed in her nightgown. The detectives at the time concluded that this was where Sherry Rasmussen must have disturbed the burglars, who then shot her 3 times at close range, before making their escape. Using witnesses from other burglaries in the neighbourhood, police were then able to create and circulate a rough sketch of 2 possible suspects.
So most burglars, they will go there and they'll take items out and they'll just leave things lying around. So it looked an untidy scene. So to all intents and purposes, by the time the officers would have turned up, they made the assumption, rightly or wrongly, that it was obviously an intruder that had entered the premises. She may have disturbed the persons who had entered. She was attacked, and then they would have fled the scene.
In your opinion, was there any signs that you thought that there's reasons why this wasn't as likely to be a burglary gone wrong?
I think one of the main reasons that, having looked at the case, would have been the jewelry box. It was in plain sight for all to see in terms of the burglars. Why didn't they take those items? They're not experts to be able to quickly look at the jewelry and say, that's not real, we're not going to take it. That should have made the officers start to think, well, why have they left this?
In the mid-1980s, with a crack epidemic in South Central LA to deal with, the overworked homicide detectives were desperately trying to locate these 2 male burglars, whom they believed were responsible for Sherry Rasmussen's death.
Talking about John and Sherry, did they have any links to crime? Could this have been anticipated?
So they have nothing to do with any criminals or crime. There was no reason for them to be targeted. Nothing at all was uncovered to suggest why A, they'd been burgled, and B, she was a victim and had been shot and murdered.
Having inspected the whole property, detectives identified only 2 things were missing. Sherry's car, which was found a mile away with the key still in it, and the other thing gone was Sherry and John's marriage license.
This was turning into a proper detective story. Was this a burglary gone wrong, or was it something else? It's a question that wouldn't be answered for 20 years.
In February 1986, in Van Nuys, Los Angeles, the lifeless body of 29-year-old Sherry Rasmussen was found in her California home. She'd been shot 3 times in what looked like a burglary gone wrong by 2 unknown male suspects. But the murderer had left something on the body.
When the forensic examiners were there in 1986, they discovered a bite mark on Sherry's arm, and they could say that happened about the time she was killed.
The police officers worked the scene and gathered evidence, like the bullets found in or near Sherry Rasmussen, later identified being from a .38 caliber gun. To talk me through what other evidence was discovered, I've asked former crime scene investigator Alex Izzard for her insight.
They looked at the whole scene, and although there was no forced entry, there was a lot of things pulled out and a lot of things looked like they were missing, and the car was gone. So straight away they wouldn't automatically think it was a murder.
But those bite marks on Sherry's arm warranted further investigation, even though DNA analysis was in its infancy at that stage.
What gets left behind when someone bites is DNA. So straight away, thinking about how we can use this evidence. So a swab would have been taken quickly and stored in a freezer so that when further down the line, when the technology has advanced enough, we may be able to use it. If we're seeing a bite mark on an individual, it suggests that there was a bit of a personal contact, especially on that particular part of the arm. It would be wrapping around somebody, then biting it. It's an odd act.
So a lot of times when you come across bite marks, you have to ask yourself the question, was it a struggle that was taking place between 2 people prior to her being shot, and Cherie is bitten at that point?
That swab with DNA from the killer would be securely locked away for over 2 decades, ready for the cold case detectives to rediscover it.
Despite biological evidence being found at the scene, the LAPD was struggling. DNA science was still in its early stages. Using it at a crime scene investigation was still just a pipe dream.
A year after the murder, and despite the investigation uncovering DNA at the scene, bullets from the murder weapon, and appeals for new information, the case remained unsolved. Fast forward 23 years to June 2009, and LAPD detective Stephanie Lazarus is being asked questions about Sherry Rasmussen's husband, John Rutten, by fellow detectives. She reveals that she and John had at one time been close.
Was there ever any relationship or anything that developed between you guys?
Yeah, I mean, we dated, you know, I mean, what's this all about?
Yeah. Well, let me see. Let me ask you. You said you dated John. How long did you guys date?
I mean, well, are you guys, is this something, I mean, you said I was going to interview somebody about art, and how you guys are, here's you know, I don't understand why you're talking about some guy I dated 1,000,000 years ago.
Well, let me ask you, what ended the relationship between you and John?
You know, it was kind of a weird relationship. I mean, we dated. I can't say that he was my boyfriend. I don't know that he would consider me his girlfriend.
And once you guys split, were you guys still friends, or kind of?
I mean, we were friendly.
Had you ever met his wife?
I may have.
Do you remember her name or anything, or?
Shelley, Sherry. I don't know, something maybe, you know. Like I said, it's been so many years, and.
The only complications with that case was that the officers initially thought that it was a burglary gone wrong, when in fact there were much more sinister reasons behind Sherry's death.
Stephanie claimed that her and John Rutten's relationship had ended prior to him meeting Sherry, but it seems Lazarus wasn't quick to let go.
Well, like in many real stories, the ending of the relationship between John Rutten and Stephanie Lazarus was not a tidy one. Stephanie tried to play it cool around John, but once she learned that John had gotten engaged to Sherry Rasmussen, she started to unravel. She went to John's mother and said, "I'm so heartbroken over this, and I love John so much." I would say Stephanie was interested in sleeping with John, and then using that as some kind of leverage to try to break up the couple.
We know that Stephanie was obsessed with John, and she didn't like the fact he was with Sherry. So she used to use any excuse to go round there and see him, to the point where she was a nuisance and stalking them.
You said you thought his wife was a nurse. Do you have any idea where she was working at the time, or?
Now that you're bringing that up, I think she worked at a hospital somewhere. And yeah, I may have met her at a hospital. At one point, I mean, he may have been dating her, or I don't know, maybe he was married. I don't even remember. And I'm like, you know what, why are you calling me if you're either dating her or living with her or married to her? And I'm like, come on, knock it off. And now I'm thinking I may have gone to her and say, hey, you know what, is he dating you? He's bothering me. And so I'm thinking that we had a conversation about that.
Like at her work, or at their house, or? I'm
thinking it was a hospital somewhere in LA.
When you said like, hey, he's calling me, he needs to knock it off, or what have you. I mean, was that civil? Was there? I mean,
no, there was not. I don't think there was anything. The conversation lasted a few minutes. I can't even remember. And what is it like? We went out to lunch or anything.
Right, but there was no like arguments or fights, or it didn't get heated or anything like that.
Not that I recall. No, I mean, I would think that would stand out.
So you didn't have any problems with her then?
No.
You didn't have any issues with her?
No, I mean.
Despite her protests, back in 1985, a year or so before the murder, and with John and Sherry becoming ever closer, Stephanie did in fact visit Sherry at the hospital where she worked, to confront her over a relationship with John.
There was a very heated argument at the hospital. I believe there were moments where it got a little physical. Security was called to escort Stephanie out, and for anyone who was looking for it, we saw a hint then of what might come next.
In 1986, at the time of the first investigation into Sherry's death, Sherry's family pushed the detectives to look further into Stephanie Lazarus. They knew the LAPD cop had been in a relationship with John before Sherry came on the scene and had visited the couple at home prior to the murder. When Sherry's father put all this to the detectives, he was told he had watched too many cop shows on TV.
It's too bad that the detectives didn't take more seriously information about Stephanie Lazarus coming over to the couple's condominium in the weeks and months before the murder. But it didn't seem like a whodunit to them. And Stephanie Lazarus at the time was kind of out of the picture. She was old news. She was an ex-girlfriend, she was an ex-lover. By most accounts, there was some interaction, but there are so many stories where the murder is preceded by a lot more erratic behavior by the perpetrator than what we had here.
The more I learn about the Stephanie Lazarus case, it's just absolutely shocking that she was never considered a suspect.
That was until 2004, when a Los Angeles Police Department cold case unit came across the unsolved murder of Sherry Rasmussen and decided to reopen the file.
A cold case is basically a significant crime, a major crime that's not solved. So for instance, murders, if you had a robbery or sexual assaults, those types of crimes, if they're not solved, they become cold cases, which means they are periodically reviewed. And what I would do is, somebody would say to me, right, Howard, have there been any forensics that were retained that could be subject of further forensic examination? Because forensics back in the 80s to the 90s to now, they have moved on significantly.
And now, that 2 decades old swab taken from the bite on Sherry Rasmussen's arm would become crucial. Because in the 20 years since the murder, analysis of DNA evidence had become much more advanced.
The cold case was opened and the test tube that was found at the back of the freezer was tested in 2005, and they would put it through the database, the national database, to see if there was any hits of anyone that had already committed a similar crime throughout the database in the US, and nothing came up. But one interesting thing that was discovered in this test was that the DNA was left by a woman.
This was a bombshell. Made the original story of burglary gone wrong look like a tragic mistake. LAPD detectives investigating the murder of Sherry Rasmussen in 1986 had finally made a breakthrough.
Nearly 2 decades after the crime, in January 2005, DNA analysis of a bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm confirmed that it had not been left by a male burglar disturbed in the act, as detectives at first thought, but by a woman. The original theory of a burglary gone wrong was beginning to unravel.
There was no forced entry at the front door and the alarm was off, and it seems that Sherry was upstairs in her bedroom. There's 2 gunshots to the sliding doors. Somebody went up there to kill Sherry. They shot at her and they missed. There's even gun residue on her face, so that person must have been quite close to get those shots out.
This image here is the bite mark on the arm of Sherry. She's there in her nightgown and there's a bite mark there. Quite possibly there was a bit of a struggle, and if Sherry's got her arm around the killer like that, trying to restrain her, perhaps she's seen the gun, and then of course the killer bites her to get her to release it and then shoots her.
The LAPD cold case investigators were now beginning to look at the entire crime scene through fresh eyes.
The cold case detectives thought that the struggle started upstairs and then ultimately came downstairs where Sherry was killed. Interestingly, the stereo that looked like it was about to be taken out in a burglary and then they just abandoned it had an interesting mark on it, and it turned out to be Sherry's blood. How had Sherry's blood got to that stereo that was put there after Sherry was dead?
And what's more, The bullets used to shoot Sherry Rasmussen were .38J plus P ammunition from a .38 caliber gun, standard issue for LAPD officers.
My understanding is that they were issued only to LAPD officers. And even if you were an LAPD officer and you had a private weapon, you could only use those bullets in that firearm.
When the cold case detectives took another look at the investigation files, they saw that Sherry Rasmussen's family all pointed the finger to one particular LAPD cop, Stephanie Lazarus, who, as well as her standard issue police firearm, also owned a second gun that matched the caliber of the murder weapon, and that weapon had conveniently disappeared.
Stephanie Lazarus filed a police report in Santa Monica saying, hey, somebody broke into my car, stole my gun, and that way they could never connect that gun with the shooting. And Santa Monica PD, LAPD, they didn't share information back in the 80s the way they do today. So it's like the investigators in the LAPD probably did not even have it on their radar that Lazarus reported a lost gun, 13 days after the murder, which in hindsight is one of the things that seems kind of shocking. But as a policewoman and later a police detective, she knew how to commit the perfect crime.
More damningly still, when investigators re-looked at the case, they saw there had been reports from Rasmussen's family, friends and work colleagues of several instances of Stephanie showing up at Sherry's home and workplace unannounced.
We had read the notes as far as from Sherry's friends saying you guys had problems or words, and they got heated. An incident at her work had occurred, and they've also told us that an incident at her house occurred.
That's just not sounding familiar at all.
And this is an incident where you showed up, you weren't supposed to show up, and things got heated.
At his house?
Yeah.
That just doesn't sound familiar.
Now you're saying not familiar because it's just something you remember, or it's just...
you know what? I'd have to say I don't remember, because I don't remember. That doesn't sound familiar.
would you remember something like that in your life?
Well, I would think, but...
Did you ever fight with her?
You mean like we fought?
Yeah. Did you ever duke it out with her?
No, I don't think so.
You'd remember that, right? That would be pretty...
Yeah, I would think so. What are they saying? They're saying, okay, I fought with her, so I must have killed her. Come on. It's insane. If it happened, I honestly don't remember it. That's all I can tell you.
This is fascinating. It looks like Lazarus had planned an almost perfect crime. And using her police know-how, she'd thrown the cops off the scent for over 20 years.
As it becomes apparent that Stephanie's a suspect, they then start looking, the investigators, as to what indicators are there that a police officer has done this, and understanding her movements on that day, as well as what she would have known about Sherry and John. So she's taken trouble to cover her tracks. She knows Sherry is on her own on that day and John is at work. Although there was some broken glass at the scene, what she didn't quite do well enough was make it look like it was a forced entry. She's gone there on her day off. She's used her own personal weapon, albeit with the police ammunition, to commit the murder, and then got rid of it. Because she knows if she used her own weapon, police weapon, then there would be questions about where that had gone if she had to then get rid of that one. She's been aware of the fact it needed to look like a burglary, another crime, not the murder. And also the fact that certainly in 1986, men were suspected of committing burglaries, not women. And certainly very few women who are cops kill.
As the cold case investigators ramped up, detectives searched the California firearms database. And there, on an entry dated 9th of March 1986, 13 days after the murder, was a record of Stephanie Lazarus reporting a .38 caliber revolver having been stolen. This clue had been waiting to be found for 23 years, but no one had looked for it.
The evidence was stacking up against Stephanie Lazarus, but it was all circumstantial. They knew the secret to solving this case was in her DNA, and they had a plan to get it.
By chance, Lazarus's office was located next door to the very cops now investigating her. Detectives were given special authorization to acquire a DNA sample surreptitiously using the LAPD's internal surveillance unit. They either needed to clear their fellow officer of the crime or take a murderer off the street.
Investigators followed her to a big warehouse store, and Stephanie got a soda, and the detectives watched her throw the soda can in the garbage, and then they went over, they picked it out of the garbage, they grabbed the straw, and now they had their DNA evidence. Her saliva. They took this DNA evidence from the saliva, they compared it to the saliva from the bite mark, and finally, years later, they had a match. They knew who had killed Sherry Rasmussen.
The DNA was a match for Stephanie Lazarus. The decision was made to get Lazarus into a secure area of the police building, an area where all visitors, even cops, were forced to hand over their weapons. They were taking no risks with their suspected murderer. I've asked psychologist Serena Simmons to talk me through the footage and what might be going through the mind of Lazarus as the interrogation progresses.
She doesn't know why she's been brought in at this point, but it's all been done under a friendly guise of, can you just come in and we want to talk to you about the case. Now what's interesting here is that to go into this room she had to release her weapon, and that was one of the main reasons that she was asked to go into this particular space. But what we can see here is that the officers are very, very clever in terms of how they've approached this. They're very, very friendly in their demeanour. They don't seem to be of any threat to her. So she goes in very, very unaware of what's about to happen. And it's why they've really set the scene well for what they then go on to ask her.
Do you know John Rutten?
John Rutten?
Rutten.
The police officers have done something very deliberate. They mispronounced his name. So they said John Rutten when they know it was John Rutten. They've deliberately done that to make her feel more at ease. She feels comfortable being in control, and that's how they want her to feel at this stage, because the more in control she feels, the more information she'll divulge.
Was there ever any relationship or anything that developed between you guys?
Yeah, I mean, we dated, you know, I mean, what's this all about?
When push comes to shove and they kind of divulge a little bit more information there, she says, yeah, we dated in a very flippant way, when we actually know that it was quite a significant relationship. She saw him for 4 years, for example. They would go on holiday together. So she's not really conveying the significance of their relationship, so she's deliberately withholding the truth.
Do you know what happened to his wife?
Yeah, I know she got killed.
So this is the first time that there's reference to Sherry being killed, and this is the first time that Stephanie verbalises for herself the fact that she knew she was murdered. Now this must have been an incredible shock to her to actually have to verbalise this and say this out loud, and so this is a really pertinent point in the interview.
I mean, if you guys are claiming that I'm a suspect, then, you know, I got a problem with, you know, with that. Okay? So, you know, if you're doing this as an interrogation, you're saying, hey, I'm a suspect. Well, now I got a problem with, you know, now you're accusing me of this.
Okay. Now, what we'd like to do is, obviously you know about all the DNA stuff and things of the nature that, you know, gets done on cases nowadays. You know, if we asked you for a DNA swab, would you be willing to give us one?
Maybe. Because now I'm thinking I probably need to talk to a lawyer.
Okay.
I mean,
well,
because I know how this stuff works, and now it almost sounds like you're trying to pin something on me.
No,
now I got that sense.
Okay. All right.
Well, thanks for giving me the courtesy. I wish I recorded it.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Stephanie, take care.
Stephanie Lazarus got as far as the hallway of the LAPD precinct when she was formally arrested for the murder of Sherry Rasmussen. She would return to the interrogation room to be read her rights.
This is absolutely crazy.
Have a seat, Stephanie.
This is insane.
Okay. Stephanie, you know you have the right to remain silent. Do you understand?
Yes.
Anything you say may be used against you in court. Do you understand?
Yes.
But what can be learned from this killer copper almost getting away with murder?
This is crazy. This is I'm like in shock. I'm totally in shock.
Over 2 decades later, damning DNA evidence discovered in a bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm was matched to Stephanie Lazarus. This led to a cat-and-mouse style interrogation of Lazarus, ending with her arrest. But what I want to know is why an upstanding police officer might commit murder.
In your opinion, was there any evidence of a build-up leading up to this crime?
I think there certainly was. John Russon was her partner, so she dated him when she was in college. They dated for a few years, and what we know is that their relationship was kind of on and off at the time. And it was during kind of one of those periods that they were dating that John picked up another relationship with Sherry, and Lazarus found out about this relationship, but nothing really happened at that point on the surface. But I think that's really when things started to kind of bubble beneath the surface, really, in terms of her kind of desires for John and kind of wanting to keep him to herself.
John Rutten would later disclose in court a shocking revelation about his on-off relationship with Lazarus whilst he was engaged to Sherry Rasmussen.
Lazarus went and actually asked John to not go ahead and marry Sherry, but also to sleep with her one last time, which John actually did. And really, for someone of Lazarus's mindset, this is someone who is feeling abandoned and trying to retain that relationship. So that would have really given her a sense of hope that really there's something still here, he might still want me, and that would really reduce her feelings of rejection. For Lazarus, I believe that the murder she committed was completely functional. She saw Sherry as a threat. She felt like she owned John, and she felt that deep sense of rejection and abandonment when he got together with her.
Is this jealousy the motive?
Yeah, so when women do kill typically in these situations, it is for the reasons you've said, so acts of jealousy. Sometimes it's for financial gain. Once she'd got rid of the person who she felt was a threat, which was Sherry, a lot of that upset, I imagine, dissipated for her, because this isn't someone who's committing murder over and over again. This was a functional act. So I think that after she got away with that, she would have felt a deep, deep sense of relief.
Stephanie Lazarus had worked as a diligent and well-liked cop for decades and had progressed from a beat cop driving a patrol car to become a highly respected detective in the LAPD's art fraud department. But now, all that was in tatters. Thanks to the DNA evidence discovered on Sherry Rasmussen's body, Stephanie Lazarus was about to face justice.
This case is a perfect example of how far we've come with technology. When this incident occurred in 1986, surprisingly, it wouldn't be that long until the very first case of DNA fingerprinting, as it was called then, was used in a court case, but it would be years until it was used regularly enough. Now, coming so far forward, we can exactly pinpoint the suspect with millions and quadrillions of chances that it could be someone else. And even though this piece of evidence was found in the freezer and it could have been deteriorating, we now know that that's not the case because of how far we've come with technology and science. All we need is the smallest drop of DNA that we can actually find the suspect.
Stephanie Lazarus finally went on trial in March 2012, over a quarter of a century after she'd murdered Sherry Rasmussen. Despite the overwhelming case against her, she pled not guilty.
So, what would her mental state have been living with the fact that she knew what she'd done?
When we look at Lazarus's behaviour over the years after the event, she goes back into kind of the normal ebb and flow of life. So she starts another relationship over time, she starts to rise in the ranks of the police. So she seemingly is able to compartmentalise that part of her life. That's something that I did, no one knows about it, no one has to know.
In March 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of the murder of Sherry Rasmussen.
It only took the jury about a day to convict Stephanie of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison and will remain behind bars for, I believe, at least another 12 years before she's eligible for parole. It's 2034, something like that.
The sentence handed down to the disgraced cop was the maximum that could be given under California state law, and reflected the 23 years of deceit that allowed Lazarus to almost get away with murder.
So Stephanie got 27 years. When it comes to sentencing for murder, is there a difference between the UK and America in their sentencing and how long you get for murder? Is there a difference?
Yeah, so the UK's got really strict sentencing guidelines that the judges have to adhere to, and there's all sorts of things that can influence extending it, aggravating factors. The US, as we see in the news, is completely left afield, and often they give sentences that are clearly going to be far longer than anybody can ever live. And they too will have their sentencing guidelines, but they are a lot longer than the ones that are ever given out in the UK.
But the question remains, why did it take so long to bring this police officer to justice? There have been many unsubstantiated rumours over the years, one being negligence by the LAPD detectives in 1986, all too keen to ignore the evidence which pointed to one of their own.
Incompetence is something that nobody would want to be labelled with, but if you realise that you've made a mistake, sometimes it's just best to put your hands up and say, we've made a big mistake here, let's try and... They could have done that 5-10 years before, not 23 years. Just think of the family, because for me, look at the stress that family would have gone through. One, they didn't know to start with who killed their loved one. It would appear that the police were dragging their feet at different stages, didn't want to identify who they may have thought was a possible suspect. Imagine if you thought you knew who the suspect was, and that person was still doing their job, going about their daily life, and it's not till 23 years later that that person is the one who then gets charged and is in the box and gets convicted. What does that say for that organization? What message does it send to the public at large? And the question has to be asked, was it because he was a police officer why it was not dealt with? It may not have been, but certainly it gives the view that that's probably what it was all about.
So, you can talk all about, well, the cops back in 1986 really bungled this, and it's a travesty that it wasn't solved back then. But, maybe there's some serendipity there in that by the time they did try the case, they had the technology to convict that they didn't have back in the 1980s.
It was reported that the LAPD carried out an internal inquiry into Sherry Rasmussen's murder case, but did not find any evidence of a cover-up. And now, Stephanie Lazarus goes down in infamy for being the female cop who, rejected by the man she loved, killed her rival and got away with murder for over a quarter of a century.